Right. Well, our final speaker before we move into panel mode, because I'm so excited to hear reflections and have an ongoing conversation with these incredible women that we're hearing from today, is Aymen Dewji. She is the founder and managing partner of ShiftRight, and she is a strategic change management leader. So she takes those big, hairy projects that lots of people are just too afraid to tackle, and she breaks them down, and she partners with companies in multiple industries to help them do big things like ERP deployments, other types of IT changes. She's certified in Agile, which is so neat because we've been talking about agility and the importance of being nimble in our approach to entrepreneurship and partnering with our clients. She is an award-winning designer and facilitator. She does a lot of leadership development work. She flies around, gets awards, gives speeches. She's just an amazing, very dynamic person, and we're really happy to have you, Aymen. And I'm just going to quickly say hello, and then I can read out the opener that you provided me about tactical inclusion. So excited to get into this with you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and including me, and for that really amazing introduction. I was like, who is she actually talking about?
It's
As
all
I heard you.
you.
So thank you
It's
for that.
all you. And by the way, that is one of my favorite parts of being an Artemis core team member is we get to hold the mirror up to our Artemis members so they can see themselves and just the incredible impact that they have. And it does look like Zoom has decided I wanted to raise my hand. There we go. So that's fun. So yes, Aymen, and we're so appreciative of your time here and the collaboration that we're working on with you around gender responsive procurement. So the setup for this is really around diversity in the supply chain. So we hear so often, we talk so much about mining companies employing more women, and we know the figure is somewhere between 7 to 13 to 15%. Across any mining company, they have sort of that percentage of women employees. However, when you look at the level of the supply chain or the companies that these mining companies are doing business with, this is less than 1%, with generally in large corporations, is earned by women-owned businesses. So we definitely want to increase that. We see an opportunity. That is the whole reason that Artemis exists, is to try to bring up the level of diversity in the supply chain. And Aymen really sees this, I would say, from a very tactical perspective, a very practical perspective, and how, as well as how this has evolved. So not unlike board governance and some of the other topics that we've had, climate, that we've talked about already today, this has really undergone an evolution, and there are lots of different protocols and things that are coming down. So tell us a little bit about this idea that we're now calling tactical inclusion. We could also call it gender responsive procurement. How is this different from inclusion more generally? And why do you see this as a future competitive advantage for mining companies?
Yeah, well, thank you for that setup. And I think you touched on a number of important pieces. So maybe I'll just take a step back and kind of provide some context in terms of, what led me into wanting to lean more into tactical inclusion, and what does that actually mean? So when we think of inclusion, as you mentioned, Erica, there's a number of existing DE&I programs, and even inclusion prior to diversity being a huge component has predominantly focused on gender. And so we see the evolution of it being, let's just say, from one particular vantage point evolving over the course of time. And now we're looking at gender even from a multi-generational perspective. So what does it mean to be inclusive as we have 5 different generations in the workplace, right? How does that affect the employee value proposition? But if I take a step back, maybe what I will talk a little bit about is, what is tactical inclusion? And if it's okay, I want to share just a slide, if that works. Let me see if I can do that here. Share screen. Just let me know when you can see it. I think it's always easier when you can actually see the, you can see the definition. So can you see?
Inclusion. Okay. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so this is my personal definition that I kind of created through the course of my own journey. So when I talk about tactical inclusion, essentially what I'm talking about is intentional action-focused steps resulting in immediate, direct, and measurable gains in customers, sales, revenue, distribution channels, and the operational footprint, visibility of women-owned and BIPOC businesses. So you'll see that this definition is very specific in its intention. And the reason for that is when you asked me initially, what is it about tactical inclusion, or why did I want to step into this? I think I approached this from multiple vantage points. Firstly, as mentioned, ShiftRight plays in a number of different industries. Energy and oil and gas, mining, retail, finance, and some of these industries are traditionally very antiquated in certain processes. And so when we think about mining and energy, those are areas where I notice, particularly as a women-owned business, the barriers to entry are even higher, right? And oftentimes when we cite the statistics from the UN Gender Inclusion Report that says that, 40% of global businesses are owned by women, but less than 1% of procurement spend is on those women-owned businesses, it gets you to wonder, well, what is it about that that's causing these inherent barriers? And these barriers—
Are we just selling really inexpensive stuff? Is that why there's that
right.
that gap?
Yeah, and I think that kind of points back to, well, what is causing the gap, right? And when we look at something like corporate procurement, what we can, similar to inclusion, it has evolved, right? So organizations have grown quite significantly within mining. There've been a lot of M&A based growth, right? And that's resulted in global supply chains and procurement systems that have grown a lot bigger and more integrated, both locally but also globally. And what that has resulted has been a very focus on what they call strategic procurement. So how do we now leverage our ability to generate a better spend for ourselves, given that we're bigger in the global marketplace? And so what we're seeing is the streamlining of procurement, not just spend, but vendors, right? So limited vendors, vendors that are able to provide their products not just at a cheaper, let's say, price because of the volume, but are able to source from multiple different marketplaces. And so these are inherent barriers that may not be explicitly seen from a corporation perspective, but that have, basically have ingrained into the system these invisible sort of barriers that kind of dissuade you from going through the procurement process with a large organization, right? So if you don't have XYZ amount that you're spending on your IT security, then you may not be qualified to be able to pitch for that particular thing, even if your product or service is not really aligned with what's required for that level of IT infrastructure. So tactical inclusion really involves helping organizations to think about their strategic procurement strategy in a more tactical way that kind of starts to look at it from the holistic perspective of what is the product or service you're looking to source, what is the value of that, both from a spend perspective, but from an end state ROI perspective. What do you actually need from the vendor in order to be able to achieve those goals? And how do we integrate that into a strategic procurement policy that is responsive to encouraging diverse suppliers, not just to compete, but to actually get awarded those potential opportunities?
Yeah, it reminds me of the conversation with Tiffany where we're considering that perspective from the point of view of the employee. And there are all of these different systems and things, right? Different people that are trying to support the employees in these different ways, and some of those things are working and some of them are not, right? Same thing with the procurement machinery and how it can engage or potentially provide obstacles for these vendors. So yeah, you touched on this really lightly, but I'd love for you to give us a little bit more information, Aymen, on your personal experience with this and what encouraged you to pay attention to this within, sort of the portfolio of all of the different types of work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think probably I'm going to speak to something that most of the women here are probably going to be able to relate to. I think starting my own company and then attempting to compete in industries where their existing procurement processes were quite complicated was one of the things that really attracted my attention here. So what I noticed generally when it comes to women-owned businesses is is a ton of funding that's focused on mentor-based support, right? So this idea that you know, you need mentorship, you need guidance, which is all, you know, not at all to dismiss the value that that provides, but there seems to be an over abundant focus on mentorship and less of a focus on capital-based funding. So what I noticed oftentimes with women entrepreneur businesses that were going through the track of either government funding is that they were predominantly focused on mentorship-based funding. Equally, when you look at large corporations that were attempting to diversify their supply chain, again, the focus was predominantly on these diverse supplier programs that educated the women-owned business on the multiple steps it took to becoming a supplier within their supply chain, without necessarily that same focus on what are the, again, the systemic barriers existing in your existing procurement process as it stands for a women-owned business that may not have the scale and the breadth that a much larger vendor is able to do. So through the course of that, and through honestly conversations I had with other women-owned businesses, I'll share a story, which is a few years ago, I was in a women-owned business networking seminar, and I spoke to a woman who was saying to me that, you know, she recently got tapped for joining an exclusive mentor-based program. And she said, you know, I've just made it to $1 million in sales, right? I no longer need to prove proof of concept of my business, and I don't really need the mentorship. I need the capital funding. So for me, what I started to recognize is that there is a misalignment in terms of what particularly women-owned business need versus what the market is giving them. And not just the market from a governmental perspective, but also from a corporation perspective. So how do we shift the needle and educate the corporations who are really in the right frame of mind, right? They want to diversify their supply chain to say, hey, just walking us through your existing procurement process is not necessarily going to result in tactical inclusion, because it's essentially just educating us on the existing barriers. We know where we're going to fall off this this chain if we follow through with it. But how do we get them to start thinking about, does it make sense alternatively to change those expectations of qualification depending on the spend? So if you are a women-owned business or any business that's going for a valued contract of 50K, does it make sense to have the same you know, requirements as some organizations that's going for 50 million, you know? And obviously not, right? So how do we start to get the corporations to be thinking differently, as well as the suppliers and the women-owned businesses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you put it that way, it just makes so much sense, right? But it seems as though if they just hadn't paid attention to it before, or they just been doing sort of, you know, business as usual, and they built the systems that they have for the purpose that they needed at that time, it's not going to meet the needs of small businesses, and in many cases, the women-owned businesses that do tend to operate on that end of the scale.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is I think on both ends, on the side of the women, but also or women-owned businesses, as well as on the side of the corporation, it's very important to be clear on intentionality, right? So if an
Yeah.
organization or a corporation is deciding to invest all this money in a supplier diversity program, which is focused on educating women-owned businesses or BIPOC businesses on how to get into their procurement program, what is the end goal? Is it just to educate them and to have the checkbox if you had, I don't know, X number of organizations, diverse businesses go through your program with the certification? Or are you tying those goals to tangible differences in your procurement spend, where you're seeing the pie shift at least slightly in terms of increasing the number of diverse vendors you have at your disposal? So I think working with corporations to start thinking slightly different about what is the end goal when they are spending, you know, money on these things, are they actually achieving the objective that they're hoping to achieve? I think that's the other piece. And equally from the women-owned side, what we've started to do much more strategically is invest in those organizations where procurement is really becoming a strategic priority, beyond just a checkbox activity for, you know, achieving UNSDG goals, but actually tactically committing to a financial commitment in terms of how they want to see their pie sliced differently and why it's important. And I think part of that education and conversation also needs to be moving the conversation away from this is the right thing to do to this is the financially smart thing to do, right? So I think the conflation of this is the right thing to do. We need gender equity to and the number of reports that are coming out from the United Nations, from the government of Canada that demonstrate that, you know, organizations that do have a diverse vendor base can see up to 34% of an increase in their ROI on their procurement spend. So leveraging those specific financial metrics that demonstrate this makes good business sense. It's not just something you want to be doing because it's the right thing to do, is the other way that we're helping organizations build the case for change, right? Because unless that case for change doesn't speak to the key stakeholders, the decision makers, it's not going to move anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, speaking of stakeholders, I'm curious how much of the objection that you get is maybe similar to some of the diversity and inclusion efforts to hire more women, for example, where we hear this sometimes that, oh, we just hire the best person for the job. And, you know, that's, and even a little pushback of like implying that the women-owned businesses are not delivering at the same level of quality as the men-owned businesses. I'm curious if there's any of that kind of argument of the meritocracy or something, or sort of pushback on creating special advantages for women-owned businesses on the premise that there's going to be a downturn in quality or a risk associated with bringing more diversity into the supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I would say that depends on the evolution and maturity of the organization. So when I was kind of telling you a little bit about the organizations whose hearts are in the right place and are starting to invest in these diverse supplier programs, but haven't necessarily changed the systemic barriers within their procurement processes, might suggest that, hey, we're already moving the needle. We have these programs in place where, you know, we had 500 women go through this thing. But if you kind of objectively and stylistically, this is my preference, is to, again, speak their language, right? The language is based on data and financials. So if you ask them, okay, remove the women-owned business piece of it based on your existing procurement spend, how much of an ROI have you generated from that investment, right? And how much were you anticipating generating? And within that circle, what proportion of that spend was on diverse businesses generally versus non, right? As you start to have the conversation, they naturally recognize that there is a huge amount of return that has not been realized leveraging their existing procurement system. So remove the conflation of this quality is going to go down if we start investing in women. Just say, okay, well, what's your baseline? How are you guys doing currently with your existing? And as you start to have that conversation, the light bulb starts to go on where they're like, yeah, why aren't we actually? And unfortunately, what we've seen is there isn't not in all cases, but there isn't a lot of rigor around the return on investment on existing procurement spend, right? So it's done arbitrarily. It's not necessarily ingrained in their performance across the business. So even asking the question, sometimes it's hard to get an actual answer or a tactical answer. So then it allows you to start to open up the conversation for, you know, is this really a conversation that we need to focus on quality and diminishing quality, or do we start with your baseline and how do we amplify what you have and then slowly get them to see, hey, you know, realistically, when you think about where talent is getting sourced from in the future, we already know that they're hitting up against a talent crisis in mining, right? And that's not exclusively just within their employee population. It's also within the vendors that they're choosing to source, because oftentimes, as we've seen, the employment context has changed so significantly that a number of specialized skill sets have resulted in people starting their own companies and then sourcing out to these organizations. So I would say it's a slow and steady process, but my approach is to meet them where they are and to remove this idea of, you know, if we do this then, and start with, well, where are you now and where would you like to be?
Amazing. Yeah, thanks for laying that out, Aymen, because I can just see how this is where the unconscious bias comes in, right? And it's doing something different. It's doing something new. We've never targeted women-owned businesses before, maybe not in this way. And maybe doing something different feels like a risk. It feels scary. And anytime, maybe to someone else, it feels like a great idea because maybe they've met some women-owned businesses that delivered over and above, which, by the way, is the norm. We go above and beyond because we have to, right? To disprove some of those negative assumptions that come with our gender. But I digress. Really, what we're talking about here is a difference of opinion. Maybe in a company that is thinking about taking on tactical inclusion or gender responsive procurement efforts, they've got some people that want to do it and some people that aren't as sure. And what you're saying, which to me just makes so much sense, is let's let the data decide. Let's go to our baseline. Let's actually run an experiment that allows us to figure out whether this is going to be good for our business or not, because there is very good data. There are excellent examples, and the UN has done a lot of work, as you were referencing, and a lot of big multinationals, Unilever, I believe, is one of them, invest millions of dollars in these types of things. Like, it is a proven model. It just hasn't really been widely adopted in mining yet.
Yeah.
So that's where we come in. That's where you come in with your tactical inclusion program and the service that you're developing for mining companies.
Yeah, and I think you can hear all the statistics you want, but unless they've personally experienced it, I think it will always feel a little bit foreign. So we're very, very much a proponent of start where you are, right? I mean, at least they're acknowledging that they want to do something differently. So what does that look like for you? And you dip the toe in to start to experiment with certain, even if it's a small project, right? And they see the return, and I think that's how you kind of start to make the progress for sure.
Amazing. Well, we'll make sure that mining companies can get in touch with you if they want to learn more about the tactical inclusion efforts that you're putting together and the gender responsive procurement certificate that you'll be piloting. Thank you, Aymen. I think I could talk to you much longer. Sorry, we've gone over time a little bit, but I really appreciate your time and sharing some of the knowledge that you have with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.